And so in this video we're going to be debunking one of what I think is the biggest myths in personal finance, which is that you have to be good at maths, you have to be good with numbers in order to be good at finance. So when someone says to you they think they're good with finance, what's the first thing you think of? You think of like a Gordon Gekko type person, you think of a real mathematical genius, you think of some anorak wearing Herbert or a real soldier of the spectrum. The main thing we're going to be looking at in this video are the skills that you really need to master, not maths, that you need to really master in order to be good with your finances and to build longer term wealth. This is something I've done quite a lot of research into, and I think there's one thing that is just completely inescapable, and it's one of the things we've talked about endlessly in other videos, which is that it's this consistent application of good personal finance habits which is going to be way more important to you to build overall financial security and longer term wealth than being able to use an abacus or being able to calculate the pi to 87 decimal places. Now, if you listen very closely, I can hear the brains of personal finance influencers from around the land exploding. So the first thing we're going to talk about is opportunity cost. So I think this is an important one to start with because this is a concept, this is an idea rather than an example. And I think when you start to look at your finances in terms of concepts rather than specific numerical examples, things start to make a lot more sense and you start to get a much more comprehensive view of how you're going to manage your money. So what is opportunity cost? Simply, it's everything you forego when you spend your money. You can basically only spend your money once. So if you choose to buy an expensive something or other, then there are a lot of other things that you can't do with it. You can't put that money into a pension, you can't spend it doing your house up. The key thing is really to think about, well, what else could I be spending this money on, and is there a better use of that money? Now, this is something we talked about in our last video. It's not necessarily true to say that you can never have nice things. I think that's one thing which, I won't repeat too loudly because some of the influencers in this space, their heads might explode like they're forming a new intergalactic star. But when you're taking on a long-term credit commitment, do you really need to be spending like $700 a month on a car? Could you maybe spend like $300 a month on a car and put $400 into savings? And over the longer term, that's a pretty big opportunity cost. So let's just stick with the leasing example. Let's say you lease a car, £400 a month for 5 years, kind of a longer lease, but whatever, we'll go with it. That'll be about 24 grand out of your bank account, out of your pocket. But if you'd saved and invested that money, that'll be about 32 grand. So £24,000 down versus £32,000 in profit. So this, big difference, and that's your opportunity cost. Delayed gratification. So again, this is another concept and another idea rather than a specific example which you can apply to just about every aspect of your life. So delayed gratification is the idea of basically making a sacrifice in the shorter term for the longer term gain. So the car example that we just went through, perfect example. But, and I'm going to keep saying this, as with opportunity cost, this doesn't mean that you need to live a life of intercontinental ballistic boredom. It's perfectly reasonable to have nice things, provided they don't compromise your longer term financial goals. So where does the idea of delayed gratification come from? Well, a Stanford professor in 1972 gave kids marshmallows, and he said to the kids, if you can hold off eating the first marshmallow and then I leave the room and come back, then you can get 2 marshmallows. Seems like a pretty straightforward thing. As someone who has kids, like they're going to eat the marshmallow. But this is the more interesting part. In 1990, there was a follow-up study, and what they found is that all the kids who had practiced good delayed gratification, they had been able to stave off their short-term urges to get the 1 marshmallow, and they got the 2 marshmallows, had better overall personal outcomes. And so the kids who did better in this, so they were able to practice delayed gratification, had a whole plethora of better kind of life outcomes. They had better educational attainment, they had a lower BMI, they had lower rates of drug addiction, lower rates of alcohol addiction, lower rates of divorce. And so this really highlights that this is just such an important skill to try and master. Now, as I say, you don't have to apply it to spending 30p or something, but just having it as a concept that you exercise when you're taking on bigger financial commitments or longer term financial commitments is just the stuff of magic. This really demonstrates why this is such an important skill to master, and I think it pays off in so many other parts of your life. For example, you might hate going to the gym, but a moderate amount of exercise done reasonably regularly during the week pays exponential dividends later on in your life. This is something we talked about in this video just here. But just again, so we're clear, you can turn on the bullshit afterburner with this stuff and use it for if you want to spend 30p on a bag of sweets or something. But don't be that person, it makes sense. Have a threshold in your mind. It will depend on what your personal circumstances are. Maybe it's every time you want to spend £50 or more, or £500 or more, you think about these things, but just have an idea in your head, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of looking at it. The difference between value and price. This is one of, I think, the most important concepts in The Millionaire Next Door. Again, this is a book we've recommended in previous videos, and I still recommend it. Still think it's worth doing. It's a good read. But here's the thing. Would you rather spend money on a cheap pair of shoes that will last you about 25 minutes, or would you rather spend, I'm not saying you need to go mad, you don't need to get a pair of Louboutins or anything like that, but would you rather spend just a bit more and get shoes that you know are going to last you a couple of years? And this is really the key thing, the difference between price and value. This is something we discussed in the previous video. You don't necessarily have to cut costs at all costs in order to enjoy life. And so really understanding what the difference is between price and value. A story that I've told in the past is we had a family friend who was in his 80s and lived out in California, and he paid for him and all of his family to go on a vacation. And I was kind of young at the time, and I said to him, well, you know, this must have cost you a lot of money. Why did you do it? And he was just like, I'm 80. Like, what else am I going to spend my money on? You know, have it sit in the bank, or, you know, buy a new car or something, or spend 2 weeks with his family. Like, that is it. That is the difference between price and value. Knowing when to spend more. Now, if you listen very closely, I can hear the brains of personal finance influencers from around the land exploding. It sounds like some of their brains have just gone supernova, but never mind. When is it appropriate to spend more? Now, this is linked to our previous example about the difference between price and value, but I think there are some instances where there is value in spending more. So, we have discussed this in another video, this one just here, and I think ultimately what it comes down to is you look at the marginal cost, and if this is your marginal gain, then it's worth doing. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're self-employed, you can get the cheapest bog standard accountant that costs this much. Okay, but then you could go to another accountancy firm. They're a bit more expensive, and maybe they're about here, but one of the big benefits is that they have an in-house tax team. Suddenly the value that you get goes up to here. And so that offset is all that you're really looking for. And this is, I think, a really important skill, and it can be really difficult to know when to spend more, and the natural inclination of people is to try and save money where possible. But I think there are some really key areas where it is worth spending more. Typical examples are generally things like insurance policies, things like lawyers, things like accountants. And so here's a sort of personal example. We had a family friend who was, unfortunately injured and suffered sort of longer term medical ailments, let's call them, and they decided not to spend money on a good lawyer, despite having money to spend on a good lawyer. They went with kind of a cheaper lawyer. That lawyer then missed an opportunity to file all the necessary legal paperwork in court in order to try and get some kind of payout for that. And so they missed out on a potentially substantial payout because they decided to go with the cheaper option. And, you know, whilst this is kind of a morbid example, I think, again, it illustrates this point kind of clearly, which is, had they gone, they didn't necessarily have to get Harvey fucking Specter down here or anything like that, but had they just spent a little bit extra on maybe a lawyer who specialises in this area, they would have filed the paperwork in time, they potentially would be much more likely to win the case, and so they would have spent a bit more, yes, but they would have got a lot more value out of it. Self-awareness and self-discipline. So if I was to be restored to my factory default settings, it is practically in my blood to want to spend money. I'm not very good at the whole self-control thing. If I see something I like, I will generally want to buy it, and it's something which I've had to really work on. It's something that I have to consciously try quite hard to overcome. You know, I see something, and money's in my account, credit card's in my pocket, and I just want to buy it. And so this is the first part, the self-awareness. Understanding that you need to really analyse yourself. You really need to think, well, if I'm left to my own devices, what are my money habits? So really reflectively hold a mirror up and ask yourself about what is your relationship like with money. How could you really improve your relationship with money? Some people don't like to talk about it, and one of the, I think, fundamental tenets, one of the really important reasons why I wanted to set up this channel is to get people to talk about money. You don't have to reveal how much your council tax is, what your mortgage is, how much you earn, blah blah, any of that kind of shit. But I think having people talk about money in a more open fashion is just so much more important. So that's the self-awareness part. Now the self-discipline part. This, for me, I think is probably the most important thing that we're going to discuss. And although it's very generic and it's very vague, it is the thing that ties everything else together. The price versus value, the opportunity cost, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff gets tied together nicely with the self-discipline. because there's no point understanding what opportunity cost is if you don't have the self-discipline to say, this Range Rover is really nice, but it's £1,000 a month, and there's a lot of other things I could do with that money, and I'm only going to use it at weekends. Do I really need to spend this money? And having that self-discipline to ask yourself those questions when you're making these bigger financial decisions. So self-discipline is the glue that holds it all together, if you like. This is something that James Clear talks about. Again, Atomic Habits. If you are involved in this niche, you'll have seen about 20,000 videos reviewing the book. Here's the TLDR. It's really good. I would recommend it, and small habits make a big difference over a long enough time period. There you go. But in the book, one of the things they talk about is the importance of self-discipline, and so I really do think that it's important. And this is ultimately the thing. You need to be your own credible sentinel on the watchtower, knowing in your own, being confident in yourself that you're not just gonna spend a load of money on a load of shit you don't need, you're not gonna go and pop loads of money in the club or anything like that, but that you will have that self-awareness and you will have that self-discipline to ask yourself these important questions. And the final thing is understanding priorities. So we had a story just a minute ago about how spending money to go on a family vacation represents a different set of priorities than squirreling money away, hiding it under a mattress, eating out of a bin, all that sort of thing. And so I really think understanding what your own personal priorities are going to be is a really important thing to do. You might have a run-of-the-mill job and you decide that actually the way you want to prioritize your spending for your kids is going to be to take them on holidays. Not flashy holidays, but you want them to see the world, to experience other cultures. You want them to have taken a decent amount of time off. You want to take them to historical monuments and go and visit different cultures or whatever. Or you might decide, actually, as you're building up your own nest egg, maybe you don't do all of those sorts of things, but actually when it comes to them going to university, you go, university fees taken care of. You go, getting on the housing ladder, done deal. And so understanding where your priorities lie, because opportunity cost, you can only spend that money once. And so understanding what your priorities are going to be financially, not just for yourself, but for the other people in your life, it's ultimately the thing that's going to inform you. One of the things we talk about a lot on this channel is once you understand what your priorities are, once you understand what your financial objectives are, that is the genesis, that is the birth of a star when it comes to, that is the big bang of your financial journey. Because once you know where you're going, once you know what you want your retirement income to be, that dictates the size of your pension pot. Once you know the size of that dictates how much money you've got to spend on your needs and your wants and what your budget's going to look like. And once you make that decision just here, that trickles down into virtually every other facet of your financial and non-financial life. And so once you understand what your priorities are, and don't get me wrong, these can change over time. I think that's perfectly conceivable. But once you understand what your financial priorities are, it then informs everything else that we're talking about. This is our second part on this topic. Link for this video will be here and will be in the description and at the end of the video. And just one last parting piece of advice. We talked about the experiment in 1972. Don't forget to eat the marshmallow. Peace.